Before we begin, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit the subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you never miss stories that reveal the truth behind the world's most surprising moments. Today's episode begins with an insult that echoed from a U.S. military base all the way to the Philippines and back. A U.S. military officer openly mocked Filipino soldiers, calling their training a joke. What he didn't know was that this single sentence would trigger a chain of events that shocked the world, changed international military perceptions, and transformed him in ways he never expected. Stay with us, because what happened next is something military schools still talk about today. Our story begins at a joint military training exercise held annually between the United States and the Philippines. The event is known for fostering cooperation, strengthening alliances, and testing the resilience of both forces. But in this particular year, tensions were running unusually high. Captain Brandon Lewis, a decorated but notoriously outspoken U.S. officer, had arrived with a mindset shaped by stereotypes. He believed American soldiers were simply superior, faster, stronger, better trained. And when he saw the Filipino troops warming up with their traditional drills, movements rooted in history, discipline, and martial arts, he smirked and whispered loudly to his team, "This is a warm-up. This looks like a joke." Unfortunately for him, several Filipino soldiers heard every word. Among those who heard the insult was Staff Sergeant Arvin Santiago, a quiet but formidable Filipino soldier known for his endurance and sharp tactical instincts. Arvin wasn't the type to confront anyone. His discipline ran deeper than emotion. But the insult stung not because it was directed at him personally, but because it mocked the generations of Filipino warriors who had developed their fighting philosophy through centuries of real conflict. Arvin didn't react outwardly. He simply nodded to his team, signaling them to stay calm. Yet word spread quickly, and by lunchtime, nearly everyone, from the new recruits to the highest-ranking Filipino commander, knew exactly what Captain Lewis had said. The Philippine commanding officer, Colonel Ramirez, was a man of strategy and composure. Instead of reacting emotionally, he saw an opportunity. If Captain Lewis believed Filipino training was a joke, then perhaps it was time to let results speak. Ramirez walked over to the American side and proposed something bold, a real test. Not combat, not an aggressive showdown, but a full tactical endurance challenge, one that combined jungle navigation, improvised survival skills, marksmanship, obstacle traversal, teamwork, and mental resilience. The kind of test where shortcuts don't exist. The kind where respect is either earned or lost forever. Captain Lewis, confident and slightly amused, immediately agreed. The rules were simple. 2 mixed teams, one led by a Filipino officer and the other by Captain Lewis, would face a grueling 18-hour mission-style course patterned after real battlefield conditions. The objective: retrieve a simulated wounded soldier, transport him across rough terrain, survive tactical ambushes, and reach the extraction zone with the mission intact. The Americans expected a straightforward victory. After all, many of them came from elite U.S. units with impressive credentials. But what they didn't understand was that the terrain favored the Filipinos. The humid air, deceptive forest paths, aggressive insects, unpredictable mud, and thick vegetation, this was their home turf. And Filipino soldiers trained for these conditions their whole lives. The challenge began before dawn. Fog clung to the ground like a heavy blanket. Captain Lewis's team moved swiftly, covering ground with confidence and precise formations. Meanwhile, Arvin's team advanced with calculated silence, conserving energy, using signals instead of words, and reading the environment like a map. They noticed footprints, broken branches, unusual bird calls, all natural indicators that American soldiers typically overlooked. The U.S. team relied on GPS and advanced gear. The Filipino team relied on instinct and experience. And within the first hour, an unexpected shift occurred. The American GPS began struggling under the dense canopy, losing signal repeatedly. By mid-morning, the course introduced its first real challenge: marshland. Deep, unforgiving mud, leeches, thorny undergrowth. This is where the Americans began to slow down. Their heavier gear started sinking. Their boots weren't designed for this type of terrain. Meanwhile, Arvin's team moved rapidly, using techniques passed down through Filipino scout units. They distributed weight, took shorter steps, and used long bamboo poles to test stability. In one smooth motion, they crossed the marshland while the Americans began to fall behind. Captain Lewis grew visibly frustrated. He barked orders, urging his men to push harder, but pushing only made them sink deeper, both literally and mentally. As the hours passed, the heat intensified. The Americans consumed water quickly, unaware of how unforgiving tropical hydration cycles could be. Arvin's team, however, avoided drinking all their water early. They understood the jungle. They collected moisture from leaves, extracted water from vines, and conserved their canteens. The Americans were impressed, though they wouldn't admit it. Captain Lewis, sweating heavily, muttered, "How are they still moving like that?" One of his men responded, "Sir, I think this is nothing new to them." A small but significant shift had begun. Doubt, just the slightest, was entering the American captain's mind. Around noon, the challenge introduced its first simulated ambush. Blank rounds, smoke grenades, sudden noise, chaos everywhere. The American team, trained for large-scale warfare, reacted in standard textbook formations. But the Filipino team used guerrilla-style maneuvers, rapid dispersal, unpredictable angles, and camouflage techniques that blended seamlessly into the environment. Observers later said that Arvin's team practically vanished into the jungle, reappearing behind the ambush zone without being detected. Captain Lewis looked stunned. His team had taken several hits, while the Filipinos had slipped through untouched. It was the first undeniable sign that this challenge wasn't going the way he expected. By early afternoon, both teams reached a cliffside descent. The Americans took the long route, using safety gear, ropes, and standard procedure. The Filipinos, however, used natural footholds and descended more efficiently. Their movements were fluid, almost instinctive. When Lewis finally reached the bottom, he was shocked to see Arvin's team already resting, calmly eating energy bars and checking supplies. The American captain felt irritation rising in his chest, not because they were winning, but because everything he assumed about Filipino training was being proven wrong right before his eyes. And the day was far from over. The next phase involved transporting the wounded soldier, a 160-pound dummy, through jagged terrain. Here, Lewis assumed his physically stronger American troops would dominate. But he overlooked something crucial. Filipino soldiers trained constantly for real disaster response, carrying civilians across floods, landslides, and collapse structures. They worked with efficiency and teamwork, rotating positions effortlessly. They synchronized breathing and steps. Meanwhile, the American team initially rushed, trying to overpower the challenge with strength, but quickly burned out. Their movements became sloppy. Their morale dipped. And each time they looked ahead, Arvin's team remained 3, sometimes 4 minutes faster. As the sun began to set, both teams faced the most mentally demanding section, navigating dense forest at dusk, with visibility dropping by the minute. Captain Lewis relied on topographical maps and compass readings, but thick vegetation distorted their landmarks. Arvin's team, however, used natural direction markers, the tilt of trees, the sound of distant waterfalls, the smell of damp soil moving downhill. Filipino troops had grown up learning to orient themselves in the countryside, often without tools. Slowly but surely, the gap between the two teams widened. Tension within the American squad grew, and murmurs began circulating. "Sir, maybe we underestimated them." Nightfall arrived with heavy rain, an unexpected twist added by the organizers. The forest came alive with insects, rustling leaves, and unpredictable sounds. And this is where Filipino training truly shined. Arvin's team moved calmly, almost rhythmically, adapting to the slippery ground and using the rain to their advantage. Their footsteps softened. Their presence became harder to detect. The American team, meanwhile, struggled with visibility and footing. Their flashlights reflected off the rain, exposing their position. Captain Lewis slipped twice, scraping his arm. And for the first time, he saw Arvin approach, not to mock, not to boast, but to offer a hand. The gesture shocked him. Arvin's words were simple. "Careful, sir. The mud gets worse ahead." Lewis felt the blow, not to his pride, but to his assumptions. Throughout his career, he believed toughness came only from elite Western training. But here he was, being helped by a man from a unit he had mocked hours earlier. He muttered a quick thanks, embarrassed but sincere. As the rain intensified, both teams reached the final 2 kilometers, now transformed into a swamp-like field where each step felt 2 steps too deep. Observers noted something remarkable. Despite being ahead, Arvin's team never taunted the Americans. Their professionalism spoke louder than any insult ever could. The final stretch required crossing a river with unpredictable currents. Captain Lewis assumed this would be the moment his team caught up. They had superior equipment, after all. But Arvin's team had knowledge. Filipino soldiers grew up near coasts, rivers, and flood-prone areas. Swimming against currents, maneuvering through unstable waters, this was second nature. They formed a tight chain using their arms, balancing weight, and relying on synchronized strokes. The American team struggled at first, losing more time as they recalibrated. For Lewis, the frustration was no longer about losing. It was about realizing how deeply he had underestimated the very people he was supposed to respect. When Arvin's team finally reached the extraction zone, exhaustion hit, but so did relief. They had completed the course with discipline, integrity, and outstanding teamwork. The Americans arrived several minutes later, drenched, muddy, and silent. There was no applause, no victory celebration, just a heavy but meaningful stillness. The observers tallied the results. Arvin's Filipino-led team had completed the mission faster, incurred fewer simulated casualties, and demonstrated superior adaptability in nearly every environmental challenge. Captain Lewis stared at the scoreboard, breathless and humbled. For the first time all day, he had no words. Colonel Ramirez approached with professionalism. There was no gloating, no smugness, no reminder of the insult. He simply extended his hand and said, "Good work, Captain. Your men fought hard." The respect in his tone cut deeper than any comeback could. Lewis shook his hand, struggling to maintain composure. He had spent years believing Filipino soldiers were inferior based on outdated stereotypes and secondhand stories. But today, through mud, rain, exhaustion, and undeniable results, he witnessed the truth. Filipino soldiers weren't just competent, they were elite in ways he had never considered. As both teams gathered near the extraction point, a light breeze finally cut through the heavy humidity. Captain Lewis removed his helmet, letting the rain wash the dirt from his face. He approached Arvin, who was checking on one of his men with quiet concern. Lewis felt something unfamiliar: respect. Real respect. "Sergeant Santiago," he said, voice lower than usual. "Your team, they're exceptional." Arvin looked up, surprised but composed. "We just do our best, sir." But Lewis shook his head. "No. Today you showed me something I didn't learn in any academy." Observers later described this moment as the turning point, where pride gave way to humility and a man learned to see beyond his assumptions. By the time they returned to the joint base, whispers had already spread among both American and Filipino troops. The results of the Endurance mission traveled fast. Filipino soldiers walked with renewed pride, not boastful, but uplifted by the acknowledgement their training deserved. The Americans, instead of reacting with hostility, seemed contemplative. Many had entered the exercise believing they were simply there to help develop their Filipino counterparts. Now, they had learned instead. Captain Lewis, meanwhile, became the unexpected center of attention. Not because he lost. Soldiers lose challenges all the time, but because of how drastically his perception had been corrected. That evening, the base dining hall buzzed with conversation. American and Filipino troops mingled more than usual. Shared meals have a strange power in military culture. They break barriers faster than formal meetings ever could. Lewis walked in, unsure of how the Filipinos would treat him after his earlier insult. To his surprise, they invited him to their table with warm smiles. "Sir, try this," one said, offering him adobo. "And this one, lumpia," another added. Lewis was caught off guard. No cold shoulders. No mockery. Just kindness. It was a gesture he did not expect and would never forget. Late that night, Lewis sat alone outside the barracks, replaying the day's events. The mud, the rain, the Filipino soldiers who moved with uncanny efficiency, the undeniable teamwork, and Arvin, steady, calm, unshaken. Lewis wondered how he had overlooked all of this for so long. He thought about the countless times he had repeated stereotypes he inherited rather than questioned. "How many times did I disrespect people without even realizing it?" he whispered to himself. It wasn't guilt that hit him hardest, it was the realization that he had been wrong for years. And for the first time, he wanted to change. The next morning, the base commander announced that footage from the Endurance Challenge had been uploaded to the Joint Exercises internal network. Soldiers gathered around screens, watching clips of the Americans struggling in the mud while the Filipinos moved smoothly. More impressive were the night shots, grainy, but enough to show Arvin's team navigating terrain the Americans couldn't even see clearly. Even without audio, the story was unmistakable. Soon after, word spread beyond the base. Civilians, journalists, and military analysts began discussing the challenge online. The clip of Arvin pulling Captain Lewis from the mud before the river crossing became one of the most reshared moments. Within days, major news outlets in both the Philippines and the U.S. picked up the story. Headlines varied, but the essence was the same. Filipino soldiers stun U.S. officer in joint military test. Some articles focused on the Endurance Challenge. Others highlighted the deeper message about respect across cultures. Social media exploded. Filipinos celebrated with pride, sharing memes, commentary, and heartfelt messages. Many Filipino veterans recalled similar stories of being underestimated. Meanwhile, Americans responded with surprising positivity. Instead of dismissing the results, many expressed admiration for the Filipinos, saying things like, "This is why we train with allies," and "respect where respect is due." In Washington, the Pentagon received briefing documents summarizing the viral incident. Rather than treating the situation as embarrassing, several officials recognized the story's potential to improve bilateral relations. They emphasized that modern warfare demanded adaptability, not just traditional strength. The Filipino troops had demonstrated adaptability in its purest form. The U.S. military began discussing ways to integrate certain Filipino jungle tactics into their own training modules. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, the armed forces experienced a surge of interest from young recruits inspired by the story. For many, it was proof that they didn't need to be from a superpower to be world-class. Back at the joint base, training continued, but something had changed. The Americans no longer treated the exercises as a one-sided mentorship. They asked questions. They observed. They listened. And the Filipinos, in turn, shared their strategies openly. They taught survival techniques that came from real experiences: typhoons, landslides, insurgencies, jungle rescues. Captain Lewis, humbled and eager to learn, attended every session. And every time he watched Arvin demonstrate something, whether it was improvised water extraction or silent movement techniques, he felt a growing admiration for the man he once dismissed. One afternoon, during a rope bridge training session, Lewis approached Arvin while the others were preparing their gear. "Sergeant," he said, "I want to thank you." Arvin looked puzzled. "For what, sir?" Lewis exhaled. "For showing me what real strength looks like. Not the kind you brag about. The kind you live." Arvin smiled faintly. "Sir, we just do our job." But Lewis pressed on. "No, you do more than that. You embody resilience." The conversation was simple, but for both men, it marked the beginning of a genuine friendship rooted in hard-earned respect. Before the joint training ended, a final ceremony was held. Nothing grand, just a recognition of cooperation and shared accomplishment. During the speeches, The American commanding officer surprised everyone by stepping up to the microphone and recounting the endurance challenge. "We learned something important this year," he said. "Strength isn't determined by who has the louder voice, the bigger equipment, or the more famous military. Sometimes, it comes from those who endure silently, skillfully, and with unshakable resolve." The crowd applauded, knowing exactly whom he meant. Then came the moment no one expected. Captain Lewis was called forward. The Filipino commander handed him a small plaque engraved with the words, "In recognition of humility, growth, and respect." The hall erupted in cheers. Lewis stood frozen for a moment, stunned. "Sir," he whispered, "I didn't earn this." Colonel Ramirez replied, "You did, when you chose to learn instead of defend your pride." Arvin stepped forward, shaking Lewis's hand firmly. For Lewis, this meant more than any award he had earned in his career. When the joint training ended, the American troops boarded their transport plane. Before leaving, Lewis made sure to find Arvin one last time. "If you ever come to the States," he said, "I owe you dinner. And a proper apology off the record." Arvin laughed. "No need for that, sir. We're good." Lewis shook his head. "It's not about need. It's about doing what's right." The two men saluted each other, not because protocol demanded it, but because respect had made it meaningful. News of the story continued to circulate globally over the following weeks. Military academies in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East discussed the incident as a case study in leadership humility. Documentaries were proposed. Analysts broke down the endurance challenge step by step, explaining how Filipino training evolved from centuries of fighting in jungles and mountains. Meanwhile, online forums filled with comments from people who felt inspired, not just by the physical challenge, but by the lesson behind it. Never underestimate anyone based on stereotypes. In the Philippines, Arvin returned to his regular duties, quietly unaware of how widely he was being talked about online. When a young trainee approached him at the barracks and said, "Sir, I want to be like you one day," Arvin smiled shyly. "Just train hard," he replied, "and stay humble." He never sought recognition. For him, doing his job well was enough. But for the younger generation, he had become a symbol, a reminder that Filipino soldiers were capable of world-class excellence. Months later, during an international military summit, Captain Lewis was invited to speak about cross-cultural cooperation in the armed forces. He stood on stage, facing senior officers from multiple countries. Instead of discussing advanced machinery or tactical doctrines, he told Arvin's story. He spoke about humility, misjudgment, and the day he discovered that real strength comes in many forms, including those shaped by hardship and history. His speech received a standing ovation. Several officers approached him afterward, saying his honesty was rare and necessary. In one interview following the summit, a journalist asked Lewis, "Do you still think Filipino training is a joke?" He laughed, not dismissively but at himself. "If what I saw is a joke," he replied, "then the rest of us should start taking notes." He emphasized that the experience reshaped his entire outlook on military partnerships. "Training isn't about who's superior," he said. "It's about learning from each other. And I learned more from the Filipinos in one day than I expected to learn in a year." As time passed, the viral story didn't fade. It became a symbol of global military respect. It reminded people that strength isn't determined by nationality or stereotypes. It's determined by character, discipline, experience, and humility. The Filipino troops who participated in the challenge continued training as they always did, quietly, diligently, without seeking recognition. Meanwhile, American troops who heard about the incident approached future joint exercises with greater openness, eager to learn from their allies instead of assuming superiority. Eventually, Captain Lewis and Arvin reunited during another international training event. This time, there were no assumptions, no doubts, only warmth and camaraderie. When they saw each other, they shook hands like old friends. Lewis said, "Ready to teach me something new today?" Arvin replied, "Only if you teach me something back." Their friendship stood as living proof of what respect can build, bridges that cross oceans, cultures, and uniforms. And that brings us to the heart of today's story. A man who insulted an entire nation's soldiers only to discover their strength firsthand and emerge transformed. The world was shocked not because the Filipinos won, but because they did so with humility, professionalism, and grace. If you enjoyed this documentary, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the notification bell so you never miss powerful stories like this one. Thanks for watching.